Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Coach Tyler here today with Dr. Lisa. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Tyler. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Well, I'm getting better.
You're getting better with that hot tea. We just got brought a cup of hot tea that was like brimming, It was about to spill on the way over here, but we figured it would give you a nice wake up before the podcast. Well, I'm excited today, and I think anybody out there who feels like they ever feel burned out, overwhelmed, is going to be excited too, because we have a special guest on the show today. We have Peter Guse on the show today, and he's going to be talking about all these subjects. So, Peter, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited for this conversation.
All right. Yeah. So let's start off by just diving into how did you get to where you are today and spreading the message that you're spreading?
Whew. Well, I'll give you the short version because this could be a whole podcast in and of itself, I guess. But I am a elder millennial. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in middle of a cornfield in Indiana. And I went off to college to become a teacher, did that, and I did not last. I didn't even last as long as the career or the degree took me. I was burnt out within about 3 years of that. And so I left the classroom, and I still consider myself a teacher at heart. We'll get into that more, I'm sure, later. But then I got into the world of corporate America. I transitioned from teaching in the classroom to education technology, and quickly got kind of addicted to hustle culture. I was working for companies as big as Amazon to small little ed tech startups. And before I knew it, I was, working 12 plus hour days when I didn't really have to be doing that, and trying everything that I could do to please my boss and employer to, again, climb that corporate ladder. And then fast forward to 2020 and COVID hit. And that was my wake up call. Something I know a lot of other millennials, I think, resonate with as well, where, life, I think, paused for just long enough for me to realize that I had completely lost touch with myself. And I was officially not just burnt out, but just completely stuck and directionless. And so it took me another year and a half after that to realize that I just needed a break from everything. I ended up leaving my full-time job and took about 2 years off to just figure out who I was and what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. About a year into that is when I first got onto TikTok with my account. And mind you, I was not a social media person. I had an Instagram account. I had my Facebook account from back in my college days, but they weren't doing anything. So I worked up the courage to be like, let me get on TikTok and just share my story. And quickly realized that I wasn't the only one feeling that way. And a bunch of other millennials were coming forward and saying, oh my gosh, you just said that in a way that I could never explain myself. And I was like, I'm just some guy over here. So anyways, that led me down a very deep rabbit hole of learning everything that I could about the brain, the mind, and the body when it came to burnout, and combining that with my own experience as a millennial and some of the conditioning and the programming that we've gone through in our upbringing that kind of got us all to this commonality place where we're all just kind of sitting out here, burnt the frack out, and don't really know what to do about it. And so that's, did I ever think that I would become like a quote unquote mindset coach? I still don't consider myself a mindset coach. I call myself like a mindset mentor because, again, I still feel like I'm a teacher. But here I am teaching everybody my own learnings through this journey. And never did I ever think that I would have a, viral post, let alone, over 300,000 followers on Instagram and TikTok. But here we are. I think people want to hear what I talk about. So that's what I'm doing.
We do. We do. Thank you for that. I have a question because I don't know. You always hear these generational debates about millennials. And, I guess I'm an elder millennial as well because I'm born in 81. So we always hear these debates about this generation is so this and they're so that. And I think millennials get a really, really, really bad reputation. But in watching and following you and some of the things that you post about, I really appreciate how you highlight some of the challenges of our generation and the things we've had to experience, and maybe that being an explanation for why we are the way that we are. So could you talk about that a little bit? Because I think people need to know, and maybe, they'll start to put a little bit more respect on the millennial term, so it won't be so negative.
Yeah. It's I guess it's kind of a loaded topic, but the way I like to think about it is like there's the rock splashes and the ripple effects, right? So let me tell you what I mean. So the rock splashes, millennials, we grew up in the 80s and 90s, and let's be real, it was a lot better back then. It was a time of less chaos. Yes, bad things still happen, but not nearly to the degree that they do today, and not nearly the information overload that we get today, where we're constantly notified on our phones, right? So like life was good. We had Blockbuster, we had Pizza Hut, the OG Pizza Hut. Life
Rotary phones.
Oh yeah, don't get me started.
We played outside.
Yeah, exactly. But all of that happened, and then fast forward to, 1999, the dawn of the new millennium, and it was Columbine. It was the stories of, oh my gosh, is the world going to end when we go from 1999 to the year 2000? And then, of course, 9/11, right, was the big one. And it just was a constant stream of these unprecedented historical events that just never seemed to stop. And, in terms of kind of where we get some of those labels, I think it's like some of these other generations, I'm not going to say names, but they'll say, oh, well, that happened to everybody, right? Like, stop being so whiny and entitled, right? But I think the thing is with millennials is like those things happen to us at such key moments in our lives when we were most excited to check off a checkbox from our list. Right? You think about, like, I graduated in 2007. What happened right after that? The 2008 Great Recession, where it was nearly impossible to find a job coming out of college. So it's just this constant stream of like one worldly event after another, to the point where it's almost like we have, I like to call it, you have unprecedented historical event fatigue, where it's just like, it's so constant that we're almost expecting it, right? Where it's like, oh gosh, even when something bad isn't happening, we're always expecting this next bad thing to happen, right? So those are like the rock splashes. But then the other big piece, and this is the biggie, at least for me, was the ripple effects. And this really goes to our upbringing as millennials. If you think back to how we were brought up and raised. We went to school, our parents, the education system, society in general said, hey, as long as you work really, really hard, you get the good grades, you get the college degree, you too can have success and happiness. And so we bought into it, right? We decided to follow that playbook that seemed to work out relatively well for other generations before us. But again, now here we are going from the 90s to 2020, where the world has completely done a total 180, and that playbook no longer works anymore. And so you've got some of us that unfortunately are still kind of stuck in that old mindset, because those beliefs have been driving our actions for so long that we're not even aware that that's what we're doing. But then you've got this other group of us that is beginning to kind of wake up and realize that, oh yeah, that no longer works. And if the old playbook no longer works, then what's the replacement? Because quite frankly, there isn't one. And so you have to start creating it yourself. And so that's where you start to ask some of the tough, deep questions of, what does success and happiness really mean to me versus what does it mean based on my conditioning and upbringing? And I think that's where so many of us are right now, is in that kind of weird in-between space where, you're just far enough away from that quote unquote old version of you that you're like, that feels safe. It feels comfortable, even though it's not very comfortable, but yet you're too far away from that like new version where it feels kind of too scary. So you're in that like really uncomfortable in-between space. And that's where I feel like I hope to be able to lend some inspiration of thought, is wherever you are in that journey, to let everybody say what they're going to say. Their opinions of you are none of your damn business anyways, right? But just focus on yourself. Focus on that reparenting process, whatever you need to do, so that you can begin to move more in a direction that's aligned with who you are as opposed to who you are conditioned to be.
I love that. I love that you're speaking to, the cultural shift that's happening, at least in my awareness, is we've been sold this hustle grind culture, right? This, if you get here, you'll be happy. This is achievement. This is success. This is where we want to go. And it feels like there's two things happening. There's the people who are propping that up still and telling us that we need to keep going that direction. And there's the people who are saying, wait a second.
Yep.
What makes me feel happy?
Yeah.
Do I need X, Y, and Z? Or am I good with A, B, and C? And I should just really be leaning on those pieces. And so I really appreciate the fact that you're bringing that into our awareness. So, to speak to that, you were a part of this grind culture. You bought in hook, line, and sinker. I did too.
Oh, yeah.
So how did you get out of that? Because, even though that was a millennial thing, I think it's something that we all get bought into at some point is the more I do, the more worthy I am. And we all know that's not true. So how did you get out of that?
Yeah. I think number one is awareness. Like once you're aware that you are, for me, it was like the big aha Oprah moment was like, oh my gosh, I am addicted to stress. Stress is my dopamine. Right. And it was like that awareness alone was that wake up call again that happened for me. That's like, I can't keep going like this for the next 30 years until with any luck I can retire, because Lord knows that's not going to happen for me. So I think awareness is that first piece of it. But then I think for me, I still work in, I guess, what you would consider corporate America. I'm very fortunate to work for a company that values work-life balance and that truly, quote unquote, I think they get it. But I know there's a lot of companies out there that don't. When I was working for Amazon, they were a company that definitely did not get it. The thing is that even for those companies that do get it, they're not going to come to you and be like, hey, you should be taking more time off, right? They're not going to hand it to you on a silver platter. You've got to be able to realize that, to no fault of your own, this is kind of where we've gotten ourselves based on some of that conditioning. And even though it's not your fault, are you willing to take responsibility for it anyways? To begin to set some of those boundaries, to begin to not guilt and shame yourself for resting because somebody older than you or somebody above you said that, we're hiring you to pretty much stay busy here and do the job, right? And I think what happens to so many of us is that we get kind of guilt and shamed into that. I like to think about the quiet quitting phenomenon, right? It's like, we finally got it. We're like, okay, I'm just going to do my job that I'm getting paid for and nothing beyond that. And what happens?
Nothing more.
Society labels it quiet quitting as a way to guilt and shame us into, hey, get back in line with the status quo, right? But again, I think what we see happening more and more, and that was the wake-up call for me, is the status quo no longer works. I've done the hard work. You told me to work hard. You told me to work harder, and I did. And guess what? That didn't work out for me still. And so now it's time for me to focus on me. And that, again, I think the biggest piece of that was just the awareness piece itself.
With that awareness, and just talking about burnout, it looks different, right, from person to person. So I know what burnout looked like for me. It's like pure exhaustion and confusion. And I remember being very sad and feeling like, what am I doing all this for? And nothing's happening the way I want it to. What did burnout look like for you? What did it feel like? Or what have you seen with some of the people that you work with and that you help? What does that even... How can people even begin to have that awareness if they're not even aware of what like burnout feels like? And
burnout's normal.
All right. It's our normal day to day. It's so normalized. So how do you help people become aware of that?
Yeah. I mean, the symptoms themselves, right, it can be so widely varying. So, I do not have like a doctor degree, right? So please don't take this advice as like me giving you like, physical health advice or what have you. But generally, right, let's talk about some of the general ways that it can show up. And a lot of this for me made so much more sense when you understand the brain science behind burnout, right? And so, for example, one of the things that happens when you move from that fight or flight into freeze mode, that dorsal vagal shutdown mode, is that your mind and your body are no longer working in tandem, right? They become kind of, quote unquote, disconnected. And so a lot of the times the way that will oftentimes show up is that we begin to shut down, we begin to dissociate. And again, this is not meant to be like, oh, this is a bad thing, right? Dissociation has its place. It's a coping mechanism.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's just when that happens over time, obviously, there's some downsides to that as well. So when you find yourself just needing to completely retreat, it's when the text messages become too much to respond to. It's when a knock at the door becomes the thing that triggers you so much that you go hiding under your bed, right? I say this kind of jokingly, but like, if you don't laugh, you cry, right? When we talk about the brain science again, one of the other really important things to understand that I always talk about with the brain and burnout is that because all of your energy is required prepared for your repeat fight or flight response. This is not a time for future thinking. This is not a time for planning about your future. The part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex that humans uniquely have as part of our structure of our brains, basically goes offline. And so that's where things like brain fog can come into play. That's where some of that sadness and depression can come into play, because your actions are not being driven by your logical, conscious thinking brain. Your actions are being driven by your emotional, reactionary brain. And the last thing I'll say with that bit is I like to think about it like a shaken up soda bottle pop, right? When we get to that place of dissociating from our emotions so much, it's like, when the stress happens, when the anxiety, the sadness, whatever feelings that we're feeling, when you're in burnout mode, again, you don't have the mental capacity to be able to process all of that. And so what do? We shove it down. We say, I'll deal with that when I have time to get back to it, right? I'll deal with that when I go to therapy sometime in my late 30s. And all of those emotions begin to build up like that carbonation in a soda bottle pop, to the point where it takes just as much or more energy just to keep it all shoved down, until one day, as you can imagine, the soda bottle explodes. And that's where you have the wake up call, where you're like, again, I can't keep going like this for the next 30 years. So those are just kind of a very small list of some of the things to kind of watch out for when, again, stress and repeated stress becomes a default mode for you.
You know, one of the most interesting things to me about burnout is when we're stuck in that fight or flight side of the nervous system, we're continuously reacting to our life, right? We're just running on autopilot, all these old patterns we inherited from our families or collected when we were younger, and we're just going, and there's no time for reflection and the ability to choose how we want to respond. And in a very real way, it feels like a lack of freedom when I think about the times in my life where I was living in just reactionary environment. And I think the biggest thing that people can do for themselves when they notice these patterns coming up is to create a little space. And I know it's hard to do, but that first vacation you officially take, where it's not, I'm going to go to this and this and this and this and this and this and this, but you're going to go sit and reflect and be with yourself. You know, that's hard to do, but in those moments, we receive these little tidbits of clarity that allow you to connect with yourself again, and then hopefully make a conscious choice of how you want to live, rather than just being stuck in that hamster wheel going over and over and over again.
But here's the thing, though, about vacations. I'll just be honest with you, right? Is like, if you decide that, okay, I'm burnt out, I'm going to go on a vacation and that's going to cure it all, right? No, it's not, because you're still in that emotional reactionary cycle, right? And so you sit down on the beach. Yeah, you sit down on the beach and you're like, oh, finally, some rest and relaxation. In the meantime, the narratives that are going off in your mind, especially for millennials that were conditioned for hard work, is, what are you doing right now? Rest is lazy. Get back up,
so
Buttercup.
lazy.
You've got things to do, right? And so that's why, you know, when I talk about my framework that I use with, you know, coaching clients and my online course and so on and so forth, it's all based around this fact, again, that one of the biggest things you need to realize about your brain and burnout is that, again, that logical thinking brain that would normally be able to move your life forward isn't able to do its job correctly. So if you're going to go on vacation, then make sure that you've got something for yourself in place so that you can regulate your nervous system enough to the degree where you can turn that brain back on, so that that becomes an opportunity for you to then plan for your future in a different direction, as opposed to, again, sticking and staying in that endless loop of just reacting based on our programming and conditioning and, you know, emotional reactions. So
what tools could people use to regulate their nervous system, just so that we don't leave them with a, you know, a good idea but nothing to actually practice?
So the first thing I'm going to say here is, please stop listening to everybody on social media that's like, do this to regulate your nervous system, right? Like, do what works for you is the first thing, right?
Yeah.
But again, think about it from a brain-based perspective for a second. When we're talking about regulating your nervous system, what we're talking about is being able to switch your inner state of being, okay? And your inner state of being has three main components to it: physical, mental, and emotional. So you can go do yoga if you'd like, right? That's going to be some sort of physical regulation for your body. You can go, you know, literally shake it out, right? Think about like animals and little kids, right? What do they do when they need to get rid of their emotional energy? They shake it out. They have a temper tantrum, right? As human beings, we've kind of forgotten about that because somebody told us along the way that we weren't supposed to do that. Do what works for you. That's physical regulation. Mental regulation, being able to build in micro breaks and micro tasking into your day so that your brain isn't overloaded with information all the time. You give yourself that time to step away, even if it's just for 5 minutes, for that brief little reset that can take you on to that next task that you need to accomplish without moving on already in an overwhelmed burnout stage. Emotional regulation, journaling, self-talk. It's simple things that we can do, but I think that we overcomplicate it so much based on what we see on social media that we think that regulation has to be this certain kind of prescribed thing, right? Versus know what's happening in your brain, and then the regulation piece all makes sense for you. Just do what works for you, right? So
you got to get the red light and the cold plunge, and you got to do the sauna.
And very specific and expensive. It needs to be expensive. Remember, we have to profit off of this burnout therapy.
Let me just say this, right? Like, I talked a little bit about the brain science, but like if anybody wants like a just practical thing they can do right now, one of the only brain research proven ways to activate your vagus nerve, which is in charge of your parasympathetic nervous response, which is your rest and relax, which is the opposite of fight or flight, right? One of the only research-based proven ways to do that is to extend your breath out more than the breath in. If you can do that, you can regulate your nervous system. So all you have to breathe in through your nose, breathe out through pursed lips. That's all. Don't make it overcomplicated than it has to be.
I love
that.
So many simple things can be such wonderful gifts for helping people come back to themselves.
Yeah,
and like you said, regulate that nervous system.
Yeah.
So, speaking to this burnout, once somebody has enough space to be able to say, at least this isn't working for me, the next step is like, actually taking some action to change it. And that step can be monumental for most people. We wake up one day, we've got kids and a mortgage and a car payment and, a family and
we
just
walk
everything.
Out.
And we're just, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to just quit that, right? So I guess the question is like for people who feel like they're in that circumstance, or maybe they have that awareness already, like I am not on the right path. How do we start to develop a life where we have the freedom to change and honor our authentic selves?
Yeah. So this is where the real work begins, right? I like to use my framework of like the 4 R's. So we've already talked about the first 2, which is being able to, number 1, recognize where you are as where you are. And number 2, being able to regulate your nervous system. The third R is where the real inner work comes into play with that reprogramming piece. This is where we get into the subconscious nitty gritty, because again, when you're burnt out, because that part of your brain that would normally be in charge of moving your life forward is not working right, it's basing all of your decisions and therefore your actions and behaviors and your patterns on everything from your past. And so when you get stressed, your brain, not able to think clearly, says, how did I respond to this event or similar experience in the past? And it, by default, uses that subconscious programming to say, here you go, this is what we do. And so, again, we stay in that same cyclical pattern. And so, if you're really looking to have a sustainable approach to this, that's where that real inner work comes into play when we talk about reprogramming. And so, we can go into the nitty gritty of like exactly what that means. But just, I guess, high level, right, is being able to understand, again, that the way that you are behaving right now is not your fault, because the majority of that programming happened between the ages of 0 and 7 years old, right? When you didn't have any say over your environment or, your surroundings, so on and so forth. Even though it's not your fault, are you willing to take responsibility anyways for it, to be able to recognize that the way that my brain is literally hardwired to make decisions for my life right now is no longer working for me? And if you've come to that realization and you are ready to then put in that, tough inner work of being able to change that, that is going to take intention. That is going to take a whole crap ton of patience, because it's not an overnight process. You are literally rewiring your brain for the version of yourself that you want to be. And this is the last thing that I'll say on that topic, right? We talk about the fourth R in my kind of framework. The fourth R is the rediscovery process. Being able to get back to the version of you before everybody else got their hands on you. And when I went out on this little healing journey of mine, I had this narrative in my mind that I had to, quote unquote, find myself. Go find yourself. And it was this realization eventually that there's nothing to find. You don't have to find anything. It's already in here. You've just forgotten about it because it's been covered up and buried for so long by a need to survive, because that's your brain's main job, is it wants to keep you alive and safe. When you do that work of regulating your nervous system, when you do the reprogramming work of being able to go back to your past and realize where did those beliefs come from, and how can I begin to reframe some of those memories in my mind so that they don't hold me stuck in those same patterns, that rediscovery process, for me at least, and a lot of the clients that I've worked with, it's not something that you have to force. It just happens naturally because you've done the work of being able to strip away all of that toxic conditioning that has become this mask that you wear around all day, every day, where you're like, I'm fine, it's fine, everything's fine, when in fact, it is not.
I love that. I love how you're talking about, our ability to find ourselves doesn't come outside of ourselves, right? There's that notion, I'm going to find myself by traveling the world and trying all these careers and doing all these things, right? And the reality is we just need to strip away all of these layers that we collected over our lifespan to uncover what's already there. I couldn't agree with that more. And I also really appreciate you telling people that this isn't their fault. I think there's a high degree of compassion and empathy that people need to experience in order to look at those deeper parts of themselves. They need to have trust with people around them and with themselves to open those doors. And if it's always based in self-criticism, right? Like, I'm such an idiot, or I should have done this, or whatever it may be, then it's always this state of fear and lack of trust and lack of ability to connect with those deeper parts of ourselves. So thank you for doing that work and for telling people that, because it's important.
Yeah. And I just want to say one last thing, if it's okay, is that I think one of the most important things that was a big aha for me is that, when we talk about burnout and stress in general, right? Like, stress is not going to go away. And so, a lot of people will comment sometimes in my posts and be like, well, it's not a mindset thing. What are you talking about? That's not why I'm burnt out. I'm burnt out because of my job. I'm burnt out because of the economy. I'm burnt out. Yes, all of those things, right? Again, those are the rock splashes. But are you willing to be able to, ask yourself the tough question of what's in my control right now? Unfortunately, we can't always control the economy and the inflation, right? But the one thing that we can control right now is, number one, how quickly we're able to get over the rock splash. And number two, how well we're able to control the ripple effects.
That's so true. I think so much of the work that we do as we grow and learn and age is so funny how it takes us back to who we were naturally born to be, to childhood. Here at WeShape, we do a lot of work around divesting from toxic diet culture and toxic weight loss culture and embracing things like intuitive eating. And, we talk about
joyful movement.
Joyful movement. The things that we did as kids naturally. Kids don't have to diet. They eat when they're hungry. They stop when they're full. They play, they run. They don't have to have a workout routine or schedule because they're active and they move and they do the things. And there's so much, I don't know that our society values the wisdom in childhood as much as we should, because it's hilarious now in my 40s. I feel like I'm just trying to recapture some of that nature as a child, the things that I understood innately as a child. And I think same thing, with this topic here of burnout is getting back to who we were, like you said before, everybody else got their hands on us and said, no, this is what you're supposed to be. This is what you're supposed to do. This is how you have to do it. There's something to be said about teaching and nurturing a child and giving them the lessons they need for life, but without killing that spirit inside of them and forcing them into this thing that's never going to serve them in the long run. So I don't know.
And
I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think we also like, there's something about our culture where we get so caught up in this word like purpose. There's so many like self-help books out there about like, find your purpose and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think it's okay to be able to have a purpose that is it's different day by day, right? You wake up today and you ask yourself, what's my purpose today? Your purpose doesn't have to be this big shiny thing. When I'm still obviously burnout recovery and being able to manage your emotions and regulate your nervous system, it's a never ending journey, right? It's not like you just come out on the other side of it, right? But when you begin to do that work and, at least kind of, for me, comparing where I was 3 years ago to where I was today, nothing is drastically different about my life. I still have a full-time job that I do. I still live in a 1-bedroom apartment with my dog, right? It's not like I manifested all my dreams and desires, right? It's just that I live my life with more peace, with more calm, with more joy. And I'm able to actually enjoy those moments of joy. Whereas before, I was so busy already predicting and preparing for the next bad thing that might happen that I didn't allow myself to feel those emotions, even when I did have a chance to have a little small break from life. So I think that's just really important to call out too, is like that getting back to your childhood self piece. It's not necessarily that your life is going to drastically change. It's just that you feel more like yourself. And sometimes that's the best gift that you can give to yourself.
I think it always is. And I'm so glad you said that, because I think, so much of what we see, especially on the internet, is like these gimmicks. Like you said, manifest your dream life. I went from poor to rich because I changed my mindset. And it's like, is that really the trajectory of
all of that's
everyone?
rooted in I will be happy when.
I will be happy
right?
when.
If I could get here, then I'll be happy. If I could look this way, then I'll be happy. If I could get this job, career, money, stuff, whatever. And I think that's a sickness
It is such
of our
a
society.
sickness.
And it's something that I see people like yourself, Peter, talking about and shedding and saying, you know what? I can be happy living in my 1-bedroom. I don't need a mansion. I don't need a fancy ass car.
Yeah.
I don't need all this craziness. And I really appreciate how you said, I don't need some giant purpose that everyone around me is praising because it's so noble.
I'm the guru of
right?
this, so
You can just, your
Yeah.
purpose can be to exist and experience life and live and show up for yourself and show up for others as it comes. And that's a beautiful existence
That
for
is
most
beautiful.
people.
Yeah. And I mean,
it's worth it.
Yeah. And, I always think about it like this too. It's like society and the constructs that we have that we put together from, a couple hundred years ago, where a bunch of guys came together and they were like, hey, this is how we should do life. And then their friends were like, yeah, let's do life that way. And now all of a sudden, 200 some years later, here we all are trying to do everything the same way that somebody did it hundreds of years ago, because that's what somebody decided then. And it's like,
They wrote that down with feathers.
yeah, exactly.
Right? Like,
It's
let's get real.
If they can create a society where we all operate by these common rules, then who's to say that we can't all create our own society where we operate by our own rules?
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. I love that. And you mentioned one thing I just would love to touch on real quick, because I'm curious how it has shaped your own journey. But so much of this grind culture gets us caught up in our thoughts of the future or our thoughts of the past. And what I've kind of noticed you saying a little bit here is just like, as you came home more to self, as you were able to be more present with yourself, like, didn't matter what changed in your life. Everything just got better. Everything got easier and more enjoyable. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to the value of cultivating presence and letting go of what might be and what has been.
Yeah. I still struggle with it today because, when I first had my first viral video, I'm like, oh, I'm going to become like this rich and famous social media influencer or whatever. Obviously, I that's not what I want anymore today. But it's so hard because you get that idea in your mind and you see everybody else, comparison culture with, you see everybody else doing things on Instagram and social media and you're like, I want that. I want that. And yeah, I think it's one thing to be able to have an outcome in mind, but I think that when we talk about like manifestation again, right? I think that, as a society, we get so tied up in the outcome as a thing And I encourage you all to try this on your own. It was a game changer for me, is like, whatever that thing is that you think you want, ask yourself why 5 times. And eventually you're going to get down to a feeling. You're going to get down to an emotion, right? Why do I want the big house, well, the white picket fence house in the suburbs, right? Because I want more freedom. I want more peace. I want to have my own space, right? I want more, whatever it is, right? Eventually you're going to get down to that emotion. And guess what? You can have that today. You don't have to have the white picket fence house in the suburbs to have more peace and calm in your life, to have more abundance. And so that's the big difference for me today, is any time that I catch myself going into that place of future thinking and trying to control everything in my life, I just pause and I'm like, okay, what is it that I'm really going for right now? And is that something that I can create the wiring in my brain for right now today?
Yeah.
I love that. Well, I hope you achieve the fame and fortune you were after, and you still choose to live in your 1 bedroom with your dog in lieu of all that.
Exactly.
Well, Peter, this has been a really wonderful conversation. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with our audience. If they want to reach out and learn more, where can they discover you?
You can find me on TikTok and Instagram, the same name, at the Peter Guse, or you can search for the Millennial Reset, or you can check out the website, www.themillennialreset.com. I have my own podcast as well, which is more of just kind of very similar topics to kind of what we talked about today. Sometimes we have guest therapists on for additional kind of self-help guidance and whatnot. So you can, check out the website, check out my social media handles, and check out the podcast as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for sharing that wisdom with us. I'm sure it'll make a big impact on our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.